It is very possible that half the people living today were once from Atlantis. The legend of Atlantis has a truly marvelous connection with Edgar Cayce. Nearly 50% of the people for whom he gave readings had incarnations on the lost continent. From these readings, which were amazingly consistent with each other, came an incredible history, a portrait of a lost civilization not unlike our own. According to Edgar Cayce's readings, many individuals' souls who had one or more incarnations on Atlantis are reincarnating on the Earth of this century, particularly in America, and the predictions he made are stunning indeed. Edgar Cayce on Atlantis by Edgar Evans Cayce under the editorship of Hugh Lynn Cayce. In Love and Light, video and narration by an humble messenger of the law of one, Robert. In Atlantean land, during those periods when there were the divisions between those of the law of one and the sons of Belial, or the offspring of what was the pure race, and those who had projected themselves into creatures that became the sons of men, as the terminology would be, rather than the creatures of God. In Atlantean land, when there were the greater questionings between the sons of the law of one and the sons of Belial, or between those that were purified by keeping of the pure strain and those that were projections by thought, individuals, or beings. Further on, this same reading defines the sons of Belial as those who sought the gratifying, the satisfying, the use of material things for self without thought or consideration as to the sources of such, nor the hardships in the experience of others. Or in other words, as we would term it today, they were those without a standard of morality. The sons of Belial had no standard save of self-aggrandizement. In opposite of the sons of Belial were the sons of the law of one, those whose standard was that the soul was given by the Creator or entered from outside sources into the projections of the mental and spiritual self at the given periods. That was the standard of the law of one, but was rejected by the sons of Belial. It sounds as if the spiritual beings who projected themselves into the earth life forms had created power themselves. Some misuse this creative power to reproduce grotesque life forms for their own purposes, interrupting the evolutionary pattern going on in the earth. This did not begin immediately. Several life readings refer to a period prior to this time. In Atlantean land, during those periods of early rise of sons of Belial, as oppositions that became more and more materialized as the powers were applied for self-aggrandizement. It was only after some became more interested than others in satisfying selfish appetites that a difference of opinion arose. For example, an individual life reading indicated that at that particular period, this person lost spiritual ground in bringing servitude to many through the aggrandizing of those things that pertain to the gratification of material things. material desires in the body. Another reading, 12 years later, gives additional details about the same period. In Atlantean land, during periods when there were activities that brought about questionings that arose between the two great forces, the period before the first destruction of the land, among children of the Law of One, who cared much about those things that were parts of the activity having been brought about by the great teacher in those experiences, entity aided in helping these to overcome. When they became aware of the relationships of the individual entity to the universal consciousness, or God, periods of progression. Entity lived to be 1,000 years old, as termed today, saw many changes in the earth and in the way in which preparations were made for the advent of souls of men to be brought to their relationship with God. I think that the things referred to were the life forms, creations of the spiritual beings who had projected themselves into materiality. They may have been mixtures of man and animal. Evidently, they were held in low regards and treated as slaves or machines. Actually, they may have been souls who had so indulged themselves as to lose any freedom of choice. They may have had and were deeply entangled in materiality. One reading already quoted in part goes on to describing these things and the controversy surrounding them. Those entities that were then the producers, as we would term them today, or the laborers, the farmers or the artisans, or those who were in the positions of what we would call in the present just machines, were those that were projections of the individual activity of the group. And it was over these then, and in the relationships that they bore to those that were in authority, that the differences arose. The same reading goes on to explain what was meant by projections of the individual activity of the group. Then we find the entity was among the children of the Law of One, entering through the natural sources that had been considered in that period as the means of establishing a family. However, they were rather as a group than as an individual family. For those who were of the ruling forces were able by choice to create or bring about or make the channel for the entrance or the projection of an entity or soul as the period of necessity arose. Then such were not as household or as families, like we have today, but rather as groups. Another reading seems to refer to this same period of time in Atlantean land when first upheavals were brought about, when the activities of the sons of Belial brought to the daughters of the children of the Law of One the abilities for enjoying the pleasures of excesses of every nature in human relationship, as well as those activities related to same. The preceding quotations describe the rise of two factions, the followers of the Law of One and the followers of Belial. Webster's dictionary defines Belial as a personification of wickedness and evil. Interestingly, this is a reference in some of the Dead Sea Scrolls to the sons of light and the sons of darkness. All this seems to have taken place at a time before the first destruction of Atlantis. In fact, the dissension between the two factions may have caused the first destruction or contributed to it. The following reading certainly indicates this. In Atlantean land, when there were those activities that caused the first upheavals and the use of those influences that brought destruction to the land, among those of the Law of One, but was persuaded by and with leaders of the land to apply spiritual laws for material gain, thus brought or aided in bringing what eventually became the destruction of the material lands. Are the ideals and purposes of these two factions of ancient Atlantis important to individuals and nations today? The answer may be found in many individual life readings. Very often, in fact, almost invariably, individuals living today are associated now with a person with whom they were associated in the past to work out some unresolved problem. Sometimes the problem has followed the individual concerned through several lifetimes. The following life reading illustrates this point very well. Yes, we have the records here of that entity known now as or called 1968 and the early experience in the Atlantean sojourn as Asmin. In giving an interpretation of the records of the entity and in giving the characteristics or manifested personalities in the present, it is well that something of the experiences of life through such sojourns be put into words, so as to give a concept of the earthly experience during such sojourns. For the activities in the physical plane then would be hard to interpret in the terms of the experience of an entity living in the present, but glimpse these, if it is possible, in your own experience. We find that in those periods there was not a laboring for the sustenance of life, as in the present, but rather individuals who were children of the Law of One, and some who were the children of Belial in the early experience, were served by automations or things that were retained by individuals or groups to do the labors of the household or to cultivate the fields or the like, or to perform the activities of artisans. And it was concerning these things about which much of the disturbing forces grew to be factors to be reckoned with between the children of the Law of One and the sons of Belial, for these were the representations of what in the present experiences would be termed good and evil, or a spiritual thought and purpose and a material thought or desire or purpose. Hence, the entity entered the experience as one of the children of the Law of One or of the One Purpose. The life existence of the entity as compared to the present would be years instead of weeks, or in the experience to live 5 to 6 to 700 years was no more than to live to the age of 50, 60, or 70 years in the present. Hence, to be understood, this must be considered in the mental experience of the entity in the present. There we find that the entity, as has been indicated, was physically in love with one of the children of the sons of Belial. Hence, there were disturbing factors. There was an attempt to influence the entity to refrain from associations with the children of Belial. 4. Compared with the present, the association would be that of a young girl with those who were given to debauchery, or to the satisfying alone of the appetites of every nature. These brought disturbing forces throughout the experience, yet there were the eventual associations or conjugations with the sons of Belial. Thus, there was the taking on of physical desires, the physical reactions, which were at variance to the teachings and the innate expressions of those who had been the compassions and associates of the entity. Hence, there was turmoil throughout that experience, yet the entity, in the whole sense, never lost sight of or sense of the need for keeping the body and mind and purpose in a correct or direct association or activity. Thus we find in the present the associations which have come about with an individual who represented that sojourn, or that one with whom the entity was associated in that experience. There have come disappointments, and the not being satisfied innately in self as to the perfect association, or as to there ever being a perfect cooperative influence. The reading went on with suggesting to the couple for resolving their difficulties, stressing that determination was required to accomplish this on the part of both parties involved. According to Edgar Cayce, many personal family problems are the result of past associations in other incarnations. This does not mean that every family squabble can be blamed on some past incarnation, but if reincarnation is a fact, and if we are usually associated with people that we have known in past lives, it is likely that many problems may be the result of our actions at that time. What is ever more important is that the manner in which we meet our problems may well determine our futures as individuals and as nations. Many individuals for whom Edgar Cayce gave life readings were able to resolve many of their difficulties and turn to their efforts to more constructive, unselfish lives. The future of our nation will probably be determined by the ideals of its citizens and their attitudes towards one another. According to Edgar Cayce, many Americans living today are influenced greatly by their previous Atlantean incarnations. A look at what happened to Atlantis and why may help us steer a safer course for America. Other readings concerning this early period refer to scientific discoveries comparable to those of the present. The language is not precise, but it sounds as if a psychic in the early 1930s were trying to describe devices like lasers and atomic bombs that were not dreamed of at the time of the reading. In Atlantean land, at the time of withdrawing from the Law of One, establishment of sons of Belial was a priestess in temple built in opposition to the sons of the Law of One. During time when there was the creating of the high influence of radial activity from rays of the sun that were turned on crystals in the pits that made connections with internal influences of the earth. In Atlantean land, during those periods when there were the destruction or separations of the land during the periods of the first destruction. Among those who aided in the preparation of the explosives, or those things that set in motion the fires of the inner portions of the earth that were turned into destructive forces. Thus, man-made destructive devices triggered off volcanic eruptions and earthquakes. This resulted in the changing of the face of the earth. Parts of Atlantis were destroyed. In Atlantean land, when there was the second division, or when there was the destruction of the lands that made Poseida, the remaining portion in which there was the greater activity of the sons of the Law of One, these periods when there was the application of much that is being discovered or rediscovered today in application of power to modes of transit, as well as to use of nature's means for a helpful force in giving greater crops for individual consumption. Period, when a great deal of thought was given to conveniences of every kind. In Atlantean land, just preceding the first breakup of the land, when there was the use of many of those influences that are again being discovered, that the sons of Belial turned into destructive forces, could be benefits to communications, transportation, etc. Now, as possibly in Atlantis, man has control of a force powerful enough to be a blessing or a curse. Additional details of the first upheavals are found in this reading. The name then was DR, and the entity was active in recording messages and directing those forces. These were not only the rays from the sun amplified by crystals, but were the combinations of these. For it was these gases that were used for what we call today the conveniences as light, heat, motivative forces, or radial activity, electrical combinations, thermotative forces of steam, gas, and the like, for the conveniences. Then this entity, the R, was among those who attempted to make such influences a part of the experience of those who were, as indicated, the producers of food, clothing, for these human machines, as we would call them today, not the machines used for obtaining power from the crystal. The use of these devices by the sons of Belial brought, then, the first of the upheavals, or the turning of the rays from the sun, as used by the sons of the Law of One, into the crystal for the activities of same, produced what we would call a volcanic upheaval, and the separating of the land into several islands, 5 in number. Poseida, the place or the settlement of that particular entity, the R at that time, then became one of these islands. Hence the confusion at the times is seen by those who would interpret such records.